Hi everyone, welcome to our event today to unpack the Ontario Provincial Government's budget that was launched earlier this month. I'm just giving folks a couple seconds to log in. We're really excited to have you here today. It's going to be an incredible conversation with some of the leading thought leaders on policy and politics in the province, but I would say also arguably the country. So stay tuned. We are in webinar only mode. So you might find that you can't, turn on your mic or turn on your video. That's so we can all focus our energies on our incredible speakers today. So we'll be starting right now. And for folks who are watching, this event is going to be recorded. So if you're taking notes or if you're, just interested about what happens next, we will be sharing this on our social media later this month. So not to worry, this conversation will be recorded. So what I'll do, I'll go into opening remarks. So again, welcome everyone for coming out today and participating in our event. And today what we're hoping to do is dive deeper into the Ontario budget that was released earlier this month. My name is Anjum Sultana, and I'm humbled and honored to be providing the opening remarks. But I will say this could not have been possible without my incredible teammate, Joanne Pitkin, who is one of the lead organizers for today's event. And this is a partnership between Global Shapers Toronto and Millennial Women in Policy. Before starting, I want to do a land acknowledgement to honor the land that we are all connecting on. So while we are meeting virtually, the organizers of this event are based in Toronto, also known as Takaronto, which is the traditional territory of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and has been the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Chippewa, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Now it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And what we also often like to talk about, and what I like to talk about in land acknowledgements, is also situate myself. I am a settler on this land. I'm an immigrant. My family came from India by way of Saudi Arabia, and I've been here in Toronto for the last 20 years or so. So I also come to this work as both an immigrant and also a settler. And this event I was mentioning is being co-hosted by Millennial Women in Policy and Global Shapers Toronto. So Millennial Women in Policy was founded in 2018 with a desire to diversify policymaking spaces that don't necessarily reflect the full diversity of this country. And back in the federal election last year, the day after, we actually did an event to unpack what happened in that federal election through an intersectional, feminist, and intergenerational lens. Similarly, Global Shapers Toronto, which is the co-host of this event, did similar events in the lead up to the federal election as well. They hosted a number of climate debates, youth-focused debates on climate ahead of the federal election. So the co-host of this event is Global Shapers Toronto, which is part of the World Economic Forum community. Around the world, young people form local hubs comprised of professionals under the age of 30 who represent diverse sectors, skill sets, and backgrounds. And the ultimate focus is on local impact. What can we do together that we can't do alone to make a real, tangible impact in the communities that we're part of? And so part of that work that happened with the climate-focused debates and just the ongoing work of Global Shapers Toronto is to make politics and policymaking more accessible for the generation that we're part of. And today's event is an extension of that goal. And so what I want to do before passing it over to our moderator is also thank our sponsor, RBC, who made this event possible as members of grassroots organizations that operate on very limited resources. Every donation makes a huge difference, so thank you, RBC. And for folks who are interested in today's event and commenting or asking questions throughout, I want to make sure that you all know that there is a Q&A function. So if you have an interesting question that comes up as our speakers are discussing this issue, make sure to put it in the Q&A, and we can make sure we address it during the Q&A section later on today. So I've told you a bit about who we are, what we're going to be talking about, and the person who's going to be leading us in this conversation is Tamara Khandaker, our moderator for today. Tamara is a journalist, a podcast host, and podcast producer. And she has been on many award-winning and many incredible podcasts. Most recently, she is a producer on Party Lines, a CBC podcast, and the specific part of Party Lines, she's focusing on Party Lines in the U.S.A, which focused on the U.S. Election that we all probably were watching very closely. For the last 3 years, she's been covering politics, Canada's role on the world stage, and issues of inequality with a focus on stories about race and immigration. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Tamara to lead us in this conversation. Over to you, Tamara.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm Tamara Khandaker. I hope you're all having a great morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. I want to first thank Global Shapers and Millennial Women in Policy for inviting me to do this. I'm really excited to be moderating an all-woman panel and to talk about the Ontario budget in a way that highlights the issues that are important to people who tend to get left out of these policy conversations. This is the Ford government's first pandemic era budget. It's a $187 billion budget. There's been a lot said about the record level of spending in it and the $38.5 billion deficit, which is the largest in Ontario's history. But how does it actually impact us, young people and women in particular? I see a lot of women in the audience right now. How does the budget actually impact us in our day-to-day lives? We have three great panelists who are going to break it all down for us. Tiffany Gooch is a principal at the Aurora Strategy Group with significant experience in running public affairs campaigns and crisis communications, advising MPPs, ministers, and the Premier of Ontario. Tiffany sits on the board of the Ontario Women's Liberal Commission. Thanks so much, Tiffany, for joining. Jessica Katuaro-Green is an intersectional gender equity advocate with consulting policy and advocacy experience in anti-racism, gender-based violence, and economic security. Welcome, Jessica. And Melissa Lantzman is the Vice President of National Public Affairs for Enterprise Canada with a lot of political campaign experience, including being the War Room Director and Chief Spokesperson during Premier Ford's 2018 Ontario election campaign. Hi, Melissa. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. So let's just dive right into it. We'll zero in on a few key themes in a bit, but knowing that the average person probably hasn't really had a close look at this budget document, especially because it dropped just 2 days after the U.S. election, I just want to get your initial reactions to this, to the budget. First, what were your thoughts when you saw it? What stood out for you? Jessica, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. There were quite a few things that stood out for me, but what I'm going to make reference to is my top three. So first, and I think the thing that is on everyone's mind right now is COVID and the pandemic and how our government's going to be addressing that. So who has said that Canada deserves praise at home and abroad for its commitment to public health? And I think that our Premier has taken that a little too literally. I think that our budget doesn't do enough to reduce community spread. I have seen little to no incorporation on how we're going to do more contact tracing within the community. In the first wave of our pandemic, we knew exactly where the outbreaks were, and although in our second wave and what we're experiencing right now, a lot less is known. Dr. Tara Kieran said that the summer was really an opportunity for us to clamp down on community spread, but I think that it's been squandered, and now it's more difficult for us to trace spread. And there were talks in September to bring in statisticians on board to be able to help us do the work of community tracing a lot better, but that was in September. and we're now 2 weeks away from December. And our budget doesn't really speak to how, or at least an in-depth, at least some type of comprehensive funding available to be able to clamp down on spending, or sorry, on community spread. The other piece that I wanted to touch on is education and how COVID has impacted our ability for young people to learn. Our province has put $100 million into hiring more teachers to keep class sizes small, which sounds really great, but the reality is that on an average salary of $60,000, the province would have to quadruple their investment just so that every single school in Ontario could just have one more teaching staff, just one. So I don't think it's enough. Our schools have been talking about almost upwards of a $16 billion budget just to keep learning safe before COVID. But now with the new necessary measures that our schools need to be able to keep learning safe for students, such as increased ventilation, social distancing, PPE, increased demand for laptops and mobile devices, the $1.3 billion investment in schools is actually insufficient to support the needs of our schools and our children in learning. It actually only covers 12.5% of what is needed to actually make schools safe and accessible. And then lastly, what I think was a real pain point for me in the budget was the doubling of the investment of the Black Youth Action Plan, which actually doubling the investment is really great, especially considering how our government has cut funding to the Anti-Black Racism Directorate earlier in the year. But Tiffany Ford, who is a member of the Youth Action Plan Steering Committee, has publicly stated that the program actually needs wraparound services to be able to support Black youth in accessing the labor market. Our Black youth are still trying to survive, and unintegrated programs or policies that focus solely on the economic development of youth but don't address the holistic experience of youth do little in the long term to actually support youth development and their economic advancement. And so the announcement within the budget actually speaks mostly to expanding what's already there and demonstrates little political accountability to address systematic issues impacting youth, such as racial profiling and police brutality. The budget proposal talks about youth prosperity through economic prosperity, but tackling employment doesn't actually disrupt racism. And so I think I think that the budget needs to be able to reflect the realities of COVID, education, and how Black youth are being impacted through these measures.
Great. Yeah, that's great context about the Black Youth Action Committee. Thank you for that. And I think we're going to zoom in on a few of the other things that you touched on as well later in this conversation. But Melissa, why don't we tell us your thoughts on the budget, your initial reaction. What did you think when you looked at it?
So important to sort of understand, I think, the context that the government finds itself, and that this is a bit not normal for what a budget document looks like, right? So this doesn't set out a long-term plan. It doesn't, it doesn't plan for the future. It doesn't project spending for the next 10 years. All of those things are missing, and you could understand why. We haven't seen anything from Ottawa because, frankly, I think there is still in firefighting mode. So once you understand that, I think the government missed the mark on conditioning the public, saying that any short-term measures that they're going to commit to are in no way going to pay for the long-term effects of what has just happened throughout the pandemic and what we're about to experience. And so as a result, I'm not sure that they even tried. So this budget's interesting in the sense that they've put this into three categories. And one was to protect our situation, which they are still very much in. And I think that's the case across the country, given that what you're seeing in the second wave. They've put in supports and at sort of the kind of the supports that are absolutely needed to try to keep as many people, at work as possible. And there are a confluence of events that don't make that, that don't make that possible. And then they started talking about recovery, and that's kind of something that's down the road. They're trying to bring it in now, but we don't actually know what parts of the economy are going to change, where things are going to be dire. And I think the one thing that's really missing in this whole narrative, and narratives across budgets, is that there's nothing to talk about renewal. Is this thing is going to change the way that we live. And we're budgeting on things that we knew in the past and how we lived in the past and programs that existed before. And it really doesn't take into account that some of us might never go back to the office. Some of us might not need the investments in transit that the province has been talking about for. Maybe there'll be less people. So there isn't that kind of thinking, and there's kind of room for that thinking, because again, still in crisis mode, figuring out how to eventually get a vaccine, figuring out things like contact tracing, which I think is no matter how much money you put into something like that, the province doesn't have one crisis plan. It has 36, and none of them say the same thing. So I'm not sure that we look at this budget as like the end all be all is going to solve our absolute problem. It's just a beginning document of this is what we have to do right now. And I think what March will bring to us, and there's another budget that has to be done before March 31st that sets out a bit of a longer term plan of what does this all mean, and how screwed are we by what happened in the last 8 months.
Yeah, I think some really important insights there, and we'll kind of zoom in on your point about a lack of vision for the future later. But Tiffany, what about you? What are your thoughts on the budget?
Sure. So I think Jessica and Melissa really laid it out, and in a few places that I've been interested in. And I'll start by saying, to Melissa's point, Ontarians have really had to change their lives in huge ways. And I've likened this year to the piano drop year. You flatten yourself, you can't really take another feather of weight, and then every week a new piano was dropping on families in different ways. Grief, of course, the financial strain, education being delivered in new ways, and families being impacted that way. And I know we'll be getting into a conversation about how this budget impacted women, and especially, but I felt like for the amount of time and grace, I would say, that Ontarians gave for waiting for this budget of 8 months, I think we understood that COVID was going to impact the ability to pull together a document like this in the crisis moment. But I think that for that grace period, there was an expectation that it would be a little bit more bold in the proposals that it was bringing forward. And a friend of mine called and described it as dry toast. And I think that was the real way I'd also seen it. And I do want to start as well, though, by thanking Global Shapers and Millennial Women in Policy, because I feel like the choice to drop the budget during the American election week wasn't by accident. I think that the idea that folks, all eyes would be on the U.S. at that moment, and that we wouldn't really be going through the process of really dissecting what was in the budget, that it would sort of come and pass and not make too much news. I'd really be interested in sort of taking an analysis of the difference between the real analysis that took place on this budget versus others. So I feel like this isn't just a conversation for Millennial Women, but I think it's an important conversation going a little bit deeper into the budget. And so I'm thankful that you're creating this opportunity. So I won't go too far into this point. I think Jessica really nailed it. I was happy to see that the Black Youth action plan there was an increase in funding, or even that Black Canadians were mentioned at all. I think this is a new era where the Canadian budget, the Ontario budget, and others are really just starting to isolate and have an understanding of the African diaspora in Canada, and the ways, the multiplicity of ways that they're negatively impacted by policy, and the ways that we need to be rectifying that. So again, I think she nailed it on the ways that it was inadequate, but I was still happy to see it named. And so another area that I'd been watching specifically too was what are the other omnibus items that are sort of packaged into the budget and run through this period. And so I was really surprised to see this gutting of the impact of conservation authorities. I thought that that was a really bold move to make in that moment, and sort of to make some of their assessments advisory instead of deciding factors for developments. And I think that that's something that should have had more public discussion, very much changes the way that we address new developments and ensure that, you know, environmental impacts are really being considered. And so that sort of sweeping its way through was really interesting. And then I'll echo Jessica here and say I feel like this is a really transformational moment for education in Ontario. It's being delivered in a way it never has been before. That's causing a lot of anxiety for parents. There was a turbulent year with teachers this year and their contract negotiations. And I felt that this, again, was also an opportunity to show that there was an understanding of that change, and especially in this time that I think we just saw last week, the possibility that we could be going home again, and there's been so much uncertainty across the board. And so the ability for school boards to be able to answer those needs is paramount, and the one-time funding just wasn't adequate for how transformational those changes are. But a lot of it just really felt in line with the mandate we saw from the beginning, like small business focus, ensuring that small businesses continue to feel supported. And again, I know that we are going to get into the women's piece, but was very surprised to see no new funding around childcare, and interested perhaps in the idea that maybe they're waiting for the federal government, since they mentioned it in their throne speech, to come forward with their own funding and show the leadership from there. But to see these really fundamental parts of our society that really require some bold changes moving forward, to not really receive that was disappointing. So I'd say dry toast and some surprises that slipped through that definitely needed more public accountability.
Thank you. Yeah, I think dry toast is a pretty apt description. I think that's a great jumping off point. It gives people an idea of the government's priorities and what's sort of missing from the conversation. And Tiffany, you mentioned the women piece, and that's actually what I wanted to start with, because this is an all-woman panel. I feel like it makes sense to start with how the budget handles the issues that women are facing in this moment. But before we even get there, it's probably worth breaking down what those issues are. Tiffany, you've been watching this closely, and I wonder if I can get you to start by talking about the context in which we're getting this budget. How have women in particular been impacted by COVID-19? And maybe you could talk generally at first, and then more specifically about Ontario. That would be great.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the title of the budget was Protect, Support, and Recovery, and so I got a little bit of a sense of for who are women really being thought through in that in those three words. And so when I think about women's support, I mean, we categorize it in two areas: so violence against women and protections, and then there's of course the economic prosperity and inclusion in the workforce. And so I think on the violence against women side, I think it's so crucial that we really understand the ways that women are being impacted through COVID. Or we asked folks to stay at home, and the numbers are coming at this point. We are into the double digits of increases for domestic violence, and thank goodness we saw a true transformation to the Ontario Women's Directorate within the last 10 years that really began to make sure that some of those institutions were being funded appropriately, but never with an understanding that we were going to reach a moment like this where their services would be this necessary. And so to not see, you know, an influx of funding that really answered that need, that really spoke to, I mean, violence against women was mentioned once for transitional housing. I think there was 30 million, but that was a pocket that they could access, not necessarily allocated specifically for them. And so this again was, especially in rural areas and northern communities, I think our ability to support women that are being impacted by violence is changed in a COVID situation. In normal circumstances, our friends are there, our family are there, they're able to pick everything up and take care of of everything, but the intergenerational risks of COVID have required us to really be thinking outside of the box, and these institutions matter that much more. And so I think that was one area of myths that could have been answered. And the second, of course, economic prosperity. So let's talk about what really is the problem here. And so childcare being very central. Even the most progressive marriages are going through moments right now of a disproportionate weight being carried between partners for childcare, and that I think also has been impacted by the shifts of education and childcare, closures and things along those lines. And so it's complex. Of course, it's going to be difficult for us to reach that, but to see no new funding, mention of 30,000 spaces, but a re-announcement of that is quite disappointing. And then, outside of childcare, that we have to think too around what the other portions of economic prosperity mean for women. This is pipelining young women into leadership, their opportunities to move up in their careers. And so there had been funding that was really focused on everything from mentorship to, women's entrepreneurship funding. And thank goodness the federal government, I would say, has continued to make sure that those pockets are available, that those organizations are really being supported, that within COVID, of course, mentorship and networking opportunities are shifted. There's moments like this where we can sort of talk about these things, but we can't connect with each other and build mentorship relationships that are really crucial to career growth. And I think another piece that I've been paying attention to is just also thinking about diverse women. And so new Canadians and supports we normally would have had in place. And, there's studies that have shown an immigrant woman coming into the workforce in Canada faces a 10-year penalty as she's growing her career. And what does that mean in a COVID context where those the welcoming services to enter Canadian society are not available in the same way? And so I think that the taking a look at all of these different ways that women are being impacted, but especially this disproportionate expectation of household duties and childcare and all of those pieces, I think that it's not enough to mention that we know that this is a disproportionate impact on women in the budget. I think women were mentioned 6 times, and 1 for that violence against women place, and then 5 in this section that said we're thinking about women but doing nothing. And so that was really again a question of when we say we're here to protect, what exactly, who were we talking about, and how did we keep that lens on them?
Yeah, Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that? And also, so Tiffany touched on this economic prosperity piece, and I'll ask you a question about that. Women are being pushed out of the workforce at disproportionate rates over the last few months. There was a September report from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce that said in March, women between the ages of 25 and 54 lost more than twice as many jobs as men, and the labor force participation rate for women had fallen to its lowest level in 30 years, which is staggering. Women have also been rehired at slower rates, partly because they're working in sectors that have been hit harder by these COVID-19 restrictions. So things like retail and food and accommodation and other service industries that involve a lot of face-to-face contact. And racialized women are feeling this even more than everybody else, the financial consequences of this pandemic. So do you think the budget does enough to help these sectors that employ women to keep their jobs? What do you think?
The short answer to the question is no. The budget most definitely does not do enough, but I'm going to give you the long answer because it's not enough just to say no. So women have lost 23,000 more jobs than men as a result of the pandemic. And I want to make note that it's also in sectors where where racialized and newcomer women are overrepresented. And so in March, when we saw or felt employers scrambling to modify the way that we do work and we do business, it's a little bit of a glimpse into what our reality may be for the next few years as we navigate the new normal. But it also may be a little bit of a foreshadow into what may soon come in the next 5 or 10 years as the result of conversations such as the future of work or automation. And so the budget has referenced skills initiatives, particularly micro-credentialing, which is, I think, great to help women learn some transferable skills.
And tell us a bit about what that is, because I think people might not know. Yeah.
Sure. So micro-credentialing, as proposed by the Ontario government, are short programs meant to that are designed to provide women with particular skills within a sector. So, for example, it may be a skill set related to data analysis, as an example, or in construction, how to doing particular job or doing particular roles. And so the idea of micro-credentialing is that it will provide women with some transferable skills that can serve as a quick pathway to employment. So the idea that the Ontario government has had is that, if we get women into these micro-credentialing programs, they can access other opportunities for employment. But I really want to question the long-term benefits of these types of programs. And honestly, I don't think that these micro-credentialing, a quick taste of skills in a wide range of careers will allow or provide women with the types of skills that they actually need to navigate career changes or career transitions. Do I think women will leave the retail and service sector as a result of micro-credentialing? Probably not. I do think it will bolster employability, but it does little in the large scope of things, or the large scope of impact on employability. And so what women actually need needed in this budget was the commitment for the Ontario government to end precarious work and to end the gig economy, because that's where a lot of racialized and newcomer women are saturated in. And so what we're seeing is that women, racialized women, again, have jobs, and they had jobs, again, in retail and in service sector. But because the work is precarious, they're holding all these jobs, that an introduction of just any type of job in COVID recovery is insufficient. We need to see the government addressing the precarious work. We need to see a push towards having women getting long-term secure work that's full-time, and removes the precarity of work. I also think that our government needs to find a way to reinvigorate these two sectors, to adjust to the ongoing conditions so that women can actually just get back to work. We need to see collaboration between federal and provincial government to recognize international credentials of newcomer women. As Tiffany mentioned, newcomer women face a career setbacks up to 10 years. So when we have newcomer women whose skill sets are being underutilized in Ontario, what we need is the recognition of their international credentials so that they can access the labor market in a fair way. Tiffany also mentioned the supports for small business. Our provincial government focused a lot on small business, and that has been sort of a key point that they wanted to focus on. But when you do a quick search in the small business section of the budget, it yields zero results for the word woman, women, or female. And so what does that tell us? That our government does not want to recognize the fact that women entrepreneurs have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. They've lost revenue, client sales at rates that are incomparable to, or should not be compared to men who, or male predominantly led businesses. And so, you know, in my work with the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce, I've seen small business, and I've heard women identified small businesses speak to this, and say that that the government, the provincial government, is not doing enough to address their specific small business needs. And what's important is that they think, our women entrepreneurs think that because our provincial government is meant to, or is looking or emphasizing small business, why aren't we emphasizing women-led small businesses? And I think it speaks to the lack of intersectionality and the lack of will to be able to look at different aspects of a person's life when it comes to being able to small business. I just want to sort of end on a point that Tiffany had also mentioned, that in the budget, there was a re-announcement, if you will, of 30,000 new childcare spaces. So there's nothing really in the budget which speaks to the burden of care, which has exponentially grown as a result of COVID. I have heard stories time and time again. It's all over my timeline on Twitter and on Instagram and all these places where women are either have to stop working altogether, or they're unable to actually work or support because of the burden of care that they've had to face as a result of the pandemic. And so when we think about the burden of care and what women actually need to be able to get back into the workforce in an accessible and equitable fashion, the including women in Ontario's economic recovery actually does very little to address that specific need. What we want to do is see our government speak what we want to see is our government not shutting down the economy, but reinvigorating the retail and the social sectors, and so that we can have an emphasis on regrowing sectors we know that women are overrepresented in or hold a lot of employment. And I think that it's no coincidence that there's a representation between women-led businesses, industries in which women are overrepresented, and the lack of political will to reinvigorate those sectors in particular.
Melissa, I'm just going to bring you in here. You mentioned in your first answer the fact that the government doesn't really grapple with like the new realities of work. And I wonder if you can kind of weave that into your next answer. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that the budget, what were you hoping to see in the budget in terms of things like childcare? Can you talk a bit about the burden that women are taking on, and did the budget deliver on addressing that issue?
So I think what we're talking about on this call is inequity in a very, very broken system that has been exacerbated by a pandemic times 10. So this is like decades of government inaction sort of in our face. Like, why don't we have online school? Like, that's crazy. Like, I spend 8 hours a day on this thing, and I have been since I was like 20 years old. So like, why can't we have internet school? It seems like it seems kind of like an easy thing to talk about this budget and says, well, they're not creating, these amount of childcare spots. It's important to say what they are doing as well, because I think it's easy to nitpick the budget to not solve the problems of the last generation that have certainly come to head now. But many of the governments across the country, Ontario included, what they've done during the pandemic is they've given direct supports to parents. It's very popular, it's very quick, and it's not a fix that we actually need for the future. Because like we said, we talked about protect, we talked about support, we talked about recover, but we haven't really talked about renewal. We haven't really talked about fixing the actual systems that in Ontario. We have a long-term care sector, which you probably didn't think very much of before a pandemic, that has been in disarray for the last 30 years. So the unfortunate part is that a pandemic for sure has disproportionately affected women. Nothing on childcare makes it more difficult in the long run, and hopefully, this doesn't have the lasting effect to keep women, from re-entering the workforce. Because I think that the focus needs to be sort of on what we can do now to keep to keep those who are in it, and make sure that people can come back to work when we come back to work. Because we talk about, we want to reinvigorate retail, yet there is a big swath of the population that wants everything shut down. So the government's in a position where they actually can't do everything. They can't keep people safe in a pandemic and reopen the economy for full participation. But there should be a focus on how to re-engage women in different types of work. I think if you want to sort of get specific, I think micro-credentialing has worked in about 16 U.S. states to get employment numbers back up quickly. And I think it's a short-term solution to see where the economy is going. And that's what you're going to see, I think, in the March budget and going forward. How do we get people back into jobs? And if those jobs don't exist anymore, what are people going to do? And unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And depending on, sort of what your situation is at home, certainly if you're a mom with kids at home, that's going to be much harder. So there has to be more of a focus on making sure that the one-size-fits-all solution actually speaks to those who need it. Federally, we'll likely see more supports to the province, but this is the only place, frankly, in the G7 that hasn't presented a budget yet. So there is no counting of what we're doing federally, but I imagine that given some of the commitments, some of that will flow down through the provinces, because the provinces can't make plans of things that they're responsible with. They've been downloaded the responsibilities, but they haven't been told about the money yet. So I think you'll see a lot more of that in March.
You mentioned one-size-fits-all solutions, and I do want to spend a bit of time talking about how this budget deals with racialized communities, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit. Racialized communities have been hit harder by COVID-19 because we also tend to work in the sectors where there's a lot of face-to-face contact, which have been impacted by restrictions to prevent the spread of the virus, and a lot of essential workers are people of color. I didn't see much in the budget in terms of specific supports for racialized people to help them recover from this. There was that $60 million that was mentioned previously for the Black Youth Action Plan to help Black youth, but beyond that, not a whole lot. Jessica, what did you think of that? Let's start with you on this. Do racialized communities need additional support from the government to get through this? And what did you want to see in that sense? And if we could keep it brief, that would be great, because I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I'll keep this answer super short. Again, if you did a quick search of the budget, there's no reference to racialized communities, particularly within that COVID section. And what we're seeing sort of municipalities speak to is there are pockets of Ontario communities that are experiencing COVID at a much increased, at a higher rate. I'm going to turn to Brampton. There's a small city, or there's a small section within Brampton that is experiencing COVID at higher rates. And so there hasn't been anything to address that, because as Melissa has said, is that a lot of the people within that community are in essential workplaces. And so what are we doing, again, to protect racialized communities? We need to see specific protections put in place depending on where those communities are. And what I'd like to see, or what I think should be incorporated into this budget, is a downloading, if I'm being honest, from provincial government onto municipalities to be able to address the needs of local communities who are often racialized. We know racialized communities are sort of there are communities where racialized peoples are more highly concentrated, and so how can we support those communities? We can support those communities by taking a more localized, community-based approach.
Tiffany, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, she nailed it again, but I would say, just to sort of bring that point back that we had talked about a little bit earlier around the sectors that we knew women were, had a higher job rate in, and then lost their jobs faster. And so I think that this is a sector specific area that we need to be talking about. And I would have expected that the provincial government would have a little bit more of a conversation that was sector specific. Perhaps they wouldn't have gotten to the point that it isolated out the areas that women were working in very specifically. But I think we do need to acknowledge that for this period of time that we asked people to shelter in place, we closed schools and childcare centers and said, stay home, that for some women that wasn't an option, that their jobs didn't allow them to stay home. And so for that area, I think we do need to, and to know that was an area that racialized women were disproportionately represented within, that we should be able to have that targeted conversation a little bit more. But again, not quite mentioned in this budget, not really dissected in the ways that it needed to be.
Yeah. There is one more group that I want to talk about really quickly before we do the Q&A. There isn't much relief in this budget for university students, and students, I guess university and college students, and students have been calling on the province to extend the temporary deferral of loans, OSAP loans, which expired in September. That didn't happen. Ottawa created a relief payment for students earlier in the pandemic, but didn't renew it or replace it when emergency worker benefits were turned into recovery payments. Instead, it seems like the government is focusing on this micro-credential thing. And what do you think of that approach? Tiffany, I'll start with you, and Melissa, if you want to weigh in after, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it in the question. I think it was a great gesture to see that deferral through March to September, but it didn't. The situation didn't rectify in that period of time, and students continued to be negatively impacted through that. And so, I think it would have been an incredible gesture to see that extended, and we're past that point now. So I'm wondering sort of what kind of advocacy it would actually take to accomplish that. And so I know we've been seeing a lot of focus on skilled trades. Again, when we're talking about putting emphasis in areas that we already know that women are underrepresented in, unless we're going to put a very specific focus on how we're going to bring more women into those spaces, I think that there's still a gendered piece to that. And so I don't know that it's going to happen anytime in the next 5 years. Maybe it's going to take 10 years, but I'm still waiting for a transformational moment in post-secondary education and skilled trades. And we combine them in a ministry, but we don't really think about them in a whole a whole way. And I think that we're at a moment, and COVID has really shown this, where it isn't about graduating from high school, going to university, working in a career for the entirety of your life. That we need to have retraining and second career, and perhaps just get to the point that we have education credits that can be used for all sorts of different things, and doesn't isolate it doesn't create red tape and bureaucracy for you to have to choose that path. Great that we're seeing investments in online portals that help you get through that, but ultimately that we need to really step back and understand the new ways that people need to be able to think about their careers and get into spaces that will train them for their next career, as especially this moment has shown us we need to do.
Melissa?
Yeah, I'll just add in quickly. After any kind of economic crisis, and I happen to be as part of the 2009 crisis, which is pales in comparison to, I think, what we're now starting to experience in terms of loss of jobs, the inequality that has been that is a result of sort of the already broken systems that we've had, and how much more of an effect this is going to have on us in 6, 12, 18 months. But after the 2009 crisis, all of the budgets across the country, the government was focused on one thing, and it was get people into the jobs that exist so we can inflate our jobs numbers. And so, you're a millennial, I am too. I don't want to do the jobs that are necessarily available. Sometimes I want to go study English literature at university. And so there needs to be, I think, a real conversation about yes, some of the schools are, machines to put people to work, and some things exist, to put a sort of a well-rounded education, component. And the world works better when both of those things are in. So I think the government in Ontario, and frankly across provinces, I think is trying to find that middle mark where they're trying to encourage more people into the trades. They are good paying jobs. I think the minister's done. The minister specifically in this case has done quite a bit to try to engage with sort of younger women's groups to get them into the trades. And I think that universities need to find their place in this government's plan, and they've got to come to the table with some solutions too. Remember, universities have saved a lot of money right now. There's no dorms. They're not being used. Their costs are much lower. They don't have necessarily international students, but how about we call on universities? How about we ask parents to call on universities to get them to play a role? Some of them have billions of dollars in endowments. So rather than the government who is strapped for cash filling that void, I think there needs to be the private sector involved. I think there needs to be universities that come to the table with some solutions in all of this. And I think that's the biggest piece missing from this, is that we don't know what role institutions and businesses are going to play, because they don't know where the future lies. And so right now, I think the Canadian public across the board and Ontarians are relying on government to get them through the initial phases of this pandemic without necessarily thinking about sort of what's to come.
Great. Does anybody else have anything they want to add before we move on to the audience Q&A? No? Okay.
I had one, sorry. I'll keep it super short. I just had one quick comment that I wanted to make because it was discussed around the increase of violence against women. So globally, we've seen a 30% increase, and those numbers are reflective of our reality in Ontario. The budget has put forward a $2.5 million investment into a new victim support grant, which is a criminal justice response to VAW. The point that I'd like to make around that is that most women who experience violence access criminal justice support far less than they do community supports. And racialized Indigenous newcomer communities are particularly avoid institutions and of particular focus, police, and for fair reason, because of ongoing negative experiences. And so there hasn't actually been a transformative investment into addressing violence against women, despite knowing that violence against women during COVID-19 has been dubbed a shadow pandemic, and is something that has been exacerbated as a result of, for example, stay-at-home policies or lockdown measures.
Yep. Thank you for bringing that up, the shadow pandemic. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the panel portion, and I think we have some questions from the audience. So the first question is, what does this budget say about climate change, clean tech, and just green recovery? And what should it have included? I guess any of you can feel free to weigh in.
I'll jump in very quickly, and I'll say, I mean, from an environmental perspective, I didn't see anything that was ambitious in the budget. I'd need to do an actual check to see where they were fully mentioned, but it seemed like where the area through which clean tech was really being pushed is at the federal level at this point, and it may also be that because there's that much emphasis federally that it didn't seem that a provincial commitment needed to be made. But again, I think that this is indicative of the mandate that this government felt that they had coming in, and very much in line with what we would have expected for what we've seen so far from the government.
I think in terms of On this one, I think that much of the relief had to come from sort of energy bills. And what they've said kind of in this budget is, look, we're looking at a sort of a bigger plan in terms of conservation, in terms of our own footprint. And I think we'll know a little bit more of that in March. But given that this is much of this budget was focused on the health spend. There isn't a whole lot more on this. And it was, I think there was an expectation that it would be a more fulsome document. This is more of an economic statement than a traditional sort of forward-looking trajectory budgets. We don't even know sort of when they return to balance. That should be in there as well. So not a budget necessarily that looks at the greater context, one that is a crisis budget. And I think you'll see much more of the plan that they laid out in terms of conservation, in terms of conservation with regards to energy in the next part of this. But immediate relief on what we use, because we're using more of it at home and less of it in big businesses that remain empty.
Another really good question. A lot of people are experiencing the mental health effects of this pandemic. There's, sickness, death, unemployment, various different kinds of stresses, being locked up inside. You mentioned that the budget focuses on health spending. What does it do to address people's mental health issues? Does it do enough in that sense?
So I'll talk about this one. I actually work in the space quite a bit with a lot of the organizations in the province. And so there is, there's frankly an unprecedented amount of money on being spent on mental health. So that's 176 million. So that's quite a bit more than anybody's ever spent before, over 10 years. And it's being matched by the federal government. So that makes it $3.8 billion. And so that was a great commitment by both levels of government that probably isn't going to meet the need that we have later on. People talk about, Tiffany, you spoke about the silent pandemic once when we talked about in terms of domestic violence. This is very much another silent pandemic that we haven't even started to understand. So look, I think there is a huge opportunity here for governments across the board to start to think about mental health in a different way, of going into a doctor's office and lying on a couch and telling them about all of your problems. We have the ability to now deliver this full scale at a really reasonable rate with very low barriers to entry. No matter who you are, like if you need to do this at 9 o'clock because the kids are screaming, you can do that. And there is actually so much that the pandemic has allowed us to think that is possible. And on this one, I think that governments are going to come together, and we're actually going to be able to do better on this one and get mental health access to more people who never even dreamed about it. Imagine being 2 hours outside of the city and having to go see someone once a week. Like that's what some Ontarians face. It's not probably you and I who are in Toronto who that doesn't take very much, but I think there's a huge opportunity and a way to make those dollars go a lot further.
And I'll jump in here too, and I'll say yes to Melissa's point, unprecedented spending on mental health, but again, not able to sort of keep up with what the need is actually going to be. And so my perspective is also in the headspace from that other equity lens around how we're spending money in mental health and cultural competency and the mental health supports that are being offered, and community sort of outreach to remove barriers to even self-thought to access of these services. I think there's still a continued piece on that, and I've also been quite interested in education as a sector, and I know we've seen a focus on mental health in curriculum, but very curious as to what kinds of bold statements that can be made around how we're delivering mental health and using our education system that's now going to be at home will now have massive mental health impacts on the students that are normally would have maybe escaped home life to be, you know, in at school, and that, you know, that at this point, if they're going home and staying home, you know, what does this mean for them too? And so I think, you know, great spends, and now we need to get into the dicey part of, you know, who's really being impacted and how do we make sure it's reaching them.
Jessica, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just quickly, I think Tiffany touched on it. The fact that there again there's some the spending for mental health lacks a sort of an intersectional perspective, particularly what I'm thinking about in communities that are racialized, who don't see the word as mental health as applicable to them or to their communities. And so I want to ensure, I think that, like all the other panelists have said, unprecedented funding, loss of support, which is amazing, and I'd love to see it's responding to a critical need right now. But I just want to make sure that when we're addressing these issues, we want to ensure that there's we're, as Tiffany mentioned, having some cultural considerations to addressing such issues, to ensure that we're not just talking about one person or a dominant experience of mental health.
Great. I think we're at time. Am I correct, Anja? Okay, yeah, I think that's it. But thank you so much, everybody, for all of your insights. This was super interesting. I don't know if I've heard a conversation this long on these issues on the budget. So really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody who is listening.
Thank you so much, Tamara. This is such a fascinating conversation. And I think a few of the panelists mentioned, you know, because of the federal election and all of our eyes were to the south of us, we actually didn't get a chance, I would say many Ontario circles, to even do a deep dive, right? And I think in this conversation, and even in the thoughtful questions our audience members asked, like, we actually left feeling more knowledgeable, but also more capable of actually figuring out where do we actually need to advocate, where are the pressure points, where do we need to push. So I really want to thank each and every one of you, Tamara, for the fantastic questions and the conversation, Jessica, Melissa, and Tiffany for really, you know, just the incredible quotables. I was kind of mentioning in the chat, like, there was so much fire on this panel and there was so much insight, and I'm really curious to see what happens next. This is part of what we want to do at Millennial Women in Policy and Global Shapers Toronto. So for the politicos in the audience and the policy walks in the audience, what's next? So for folks who've been following what's happening federally, it's anticipated in early December, there's going to be some sort of federal fiscal update. So we'll be taking a look at Global Shapers Toronto, for example, and Millennial Women Policy to see what's there from an intergenerational lens. But then also looking into the spring, Ontario is going to have a budget. The federal government's going to be having a budget. So we're interested in revisiting this concept, this panel, and unpacking it. Unfortunately, the consequences of this time will be felt for decades to come, both good and bad. And unfortunately, there isn't that intergenerational lens. So that's what we're hoping to do. And we're really glad that everyone here is kind of committed to that mission. And thank you so much to everyone here. So with that, I'll sign off on behalf of myself, Millennial Women in Policy, Global Shapers Toronto, and Joanne, who's one of the lead organizers. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again to RBC for making this possible. And with that, bye for now, but we'll be in touch very soon, I'm sure. Bye, everyone.
Bye.